Hello class, today we're going to be focusing on Chapter 6, which is Social Control, Crime, and Deviance. Okay folks, so this first concept that I wanted to talk about is called social control. And social control is known as any sort of technique or strategy that is used by a group in order to prevent deviant behavior. Now, some of you may not be familiar with that term deviance, so I'm going to define it for you very quickly. Now, deviance is any sort of behavior or a trait or even a belief, right? Even your thoughts might be deviant. It's any sort of thought, belief, or trait that departs from a norm and generates a negative reaction in a particular group. So to give you an example, if you think that the earth is flat and the rest of the people around you in your society or in your community think that the earth is round, then that is a belief that is considered deviant. And it's likely that it's going to generate a negative reaction among your peers that you believe that the earth is flat. So a possible negative reaction might be to ridicule you for your beliefs. Another type of negative reaction might be just to banish you from the community, maybe because you don't think like them. So they say, well, we all think the earth is round, so maybe it's just better that you leave. So that is considered deviant behavior, and the response to that would be considered a sanction, which is what I wanted to talk about next. So what different forms of social control do parents exhibit towards their children? Can you think of any types of social control? What are the techniques and strategies that your parents used on you when you were growing up to try to prevent any sort of deviant behavior among yourself or among your siblings? I want you to think about that for a little bit. So I'm sure you already thought about some of the strategies that your parents use. Often when I ask this question in class, students will say, well, my parents grounded me. My parents gave me a talking to for hours just to make sure I was on the right path. So there's all these types of social control. And as far as peers go, they also practice social control. So like, what did your peer group do when you were in high school or when you were in middle school? What did they do to try to prevent you from being deviant? And deviance among your friends might be a little different. Like for your friends, it might have been the norm to, let's say, maybe smoke cigarettes. And your parents would see that as deviant behavior, but among your group of friends, maybe that was the norm. And if you were to turn them down, they would say, "Oh, well, you're being deviant. You're departing from our group norms." So, what did your friends do to stop you from being deviant? Well, one of the things that they might have done was to not talk to you, to try to get you to do what they wanted. They might not have talked to you. They might have excluded you. Not all friend groups do this, but they might ridicule you, make fun of you, like, oh, you're scared. You're a little baby. You don't want to smoke with us. So all sorts of things that peers do to make sure you're not deviant. And then the same thing goes for the government. So the government tries to enact certain laws, policies to make sure that you are not deviant. And the way that they prevent that is by ticketing you or by maybe throwing you in jail if you break the law. So if you can see from all these examples, for the most part, people obey social norms both because of the way they've been socialized by both their parents or their peer group or the government, but also because of sanctions. And we've already gone over sanctions in one of the previous chapters. So these are rewards or punishments that a norm associates with a behavior or an appearance. And I gave you some examples already in the parent, the peer, and the government examples, but you can try to think of some on your own. And let's move on to the two different types of social control, which are informal and formal social control. So informal social control is carried out casually by ordinary people through such means as laughter, smiles, or ridicule. For example, say you're at the Olive Garden and you burp loudly while you are eating your meal. And one way that the restaurant goers would try to control you is by looking in your direction and giving you a dirty look. Another way to try to control you would be to laugh at you, like laugh at your rudeness. So those are informal social control, and it's just ordinary people. It's people at the restaurant eating. They're not authority figures, and it's not like they're gonna call the cops and have them arrest you just because you burped, right? It's not that serious. You didn't violate a serious norm, so that's what makes it casual. Now, with the formal social control, the violation of a social norm is a little bit more serious, which is why this type of social control is carried out by authorized agents. Authorized mean authority figures, such as police officers, judges, school administrators, and employers. Now, if you break the law, and let's say if you break the law, speeding on the freeway, that's just a ticket. But it's still considered a type of formal social control because it's carried out by an authorized agent. But even more severe than that would be if you assault somebody. If you assault somebody, you are going to end up in jail, right? Whether it's for 1 to 3 years. And that is also a more severe type of social control carried out by the criminal justice system. And formal social controls, they are used as a last resort when socialization and the informal sanctions, the slaps on the hand don't bring about the desired behaviors. That is when people resort to formal social control. I mean, just think about teachers in high school. You guys probably all remember high school, and not to say that everybody in high school misbehaved, but in high school, I would say that you're allowed to act a little bit more immature. Your teachers are a little bit more understanding, and students can get unruly. But they give you multiple warnings in class. If that didn't work, then maybe they used a more formal type of social control, which is to give you Saturday school, like if you kept being disruptive or truant, or started a fight with another student. These are all things that might happen to you, right? A suspension or a Saturday school. But if that didn't work in terms of straightening you out, then they would go into more severe forms of social control, where they would send you to the school administrators, maybe the principal, the vice principal, and they would say, this student is not listening. We're going to have to send him to a continuation high school because he's too much to handle, or she is too much to handle. And yes, we're just going to send them over. That's what we recommend. So your school tries to give you many chances before they send you off to the continuation school. At least that was my experience in my high school. And the reason that is because they don't want to lose you as a productive member of society, and they know that if they just write you off and send you off to the continuation school right away, that you might become deviant later on. You might not finish high school. You might not have a job. You might start engaging in crime. So it's in society's best interest to give you as many chances as they can without jeopardizing the safety or even the learning experience of other people. So, another thing about social control is that sometimes we have to balance one form of social control against another. I have an example of binge drinking in college. So, many of you are going to go off to the university after you finish your PCC career, and some of you might end up dorming at the colleges. Now, with the dorms, they have rules. They tell you that you cannot drink. Like, there's not supposed to be any sort of drinking or smoking or taking any illegal substances. So they let you know that. But then, say for example, you're on a floor with a bunch of other students who love to party, and they're telling you, who cares about these rules? Um, let's have some fun. We're in college, and they throw private parties on your dorm room floor, and they invite all these other students, and you're kind of worried, right? You're kind of worried that you might get caught because you know your school's rules are to not drink, but then you know that the rules of being part of a college student, right, of being a proper, a dorm student is to party. So sometimes, again, you have to balance the social control of your peers against the social control of the campus. So you have conflicting social control. Okay, folks, so the other terms that I want to get into is conformity and obedience. Conformity is the extent to which an individual, like you or like myself, complies with group norms or expectations. And conformity is an informal type of compliance. So the people that you and I are trying to comply with are usually ordinary people like your friends or your family. The best example I can give is a teenager trying to dress like their peer group. So if that teenager belongs to the goth group, then they're probably going to try to show up wearing all black and wearing like very dark makeup and a nose piercing possibly. But yes, that would be them conforming. Another example that I often bring up in class, especially when the majority of my class is composed of young people, I asked them about social media and I said, how many of you have social media? And most of them, probably 85% of them raise their hands and they say, yeah, I have social media. And when I talk about social media, I mean like how many of you have a Facebook account? How many of you have an Instagram or a Twitter? And usually, like I said, they always, like 85% of them say, I do, I do. So for the rest, I usually ask them, the 15% that don't raise their hand, I say, why don't you guys have social media, right? You guys are young. You guys should all have social media. And they say, oh, well, because that's just, for me, it's a waste of time. Or maybe they feel like it's like an invasion of their privacy. Whatever their reasons may be, I say, well, how do you feel about like when people, how people react to you not having Facebook? Because when other young people see that they don't have social media, they try to get them to conform. That's the point that I try to prove through this question. And yeah, and they always tell me, yeah, they say, well, you're weird, or why don't you have Facebook? Or did you get my invite on Facebook? I invited you to the party, and then the person says, no, I didn't get an invite. If you wanted to invite me, you could have texted me. I'm gonna say, well, that's your fault for not having Facebook. So they do all these little passive aggressive behaviors to try to get this person to conform. And it's really funny when I do this activity in class because they notice kind of these little behaviors, like these little tensions that they are sensing from their friends because just because they don't have social media and because they're young and it's expected that they should have social media. And the other concept that I wanted to talk about was obedience. So this is compliance with a higher authority in a hierarchical structure. A hierarchy or a hierarchical structure, an example of that would be like a pyramid, and you have the king at the very top of the pyramid, then you have the nobility in the middle, and the peasants at the bottom. And this type of compliance is more formal than conformity, right? Because conformity was informal, it's just ordinary citizens that you're trying to comply with. Over here, it's higher authorities. When you're trying to be obedient, it's with higher authorities. And the best example I can give you is of a new recruit in the military. So you all know that in the army, they have all these different ranks, right? At the very top of the pyramid would be the major general. Underneath him would be the colonel, the captain, the staff sergeant, the corporals, and the soldiers or the privates. So the privates are at the very bottom of that hierarchy, and the soldier, they have to obey all of the people above them, right? The people that I just listed. If the general comes up to them, they have to salute them. They have to have a certain level of respect. Same thing if a captain or a corporal comes up to them, because they are at the bottom of that hierarchy. So they have to obey. Now, with people at their same level, like other soldiers, they do not have to obey. They have to conform. So with other soldiers, they usually soldiers within a troop, they develop specific like language, habits, inside jokes, right? And they kind of expect all the recruits in their troop to kind of mesh well with them or play well with their group. So it's expected that you will conform to that little troop. But with the other people, right, the generals, the colonels, the captains, the soldier has to obey. Now let's talk about a famous study on conformity and obedience. So one of the most famous experiments ever conducted on social obedience was conducted by social scientist Stanley Milgram in 1963. And he had a question. He said, how far will people go when obeying authority? So why did he have this question? Well, he actually had this question because he wondered about Nazi involvement in the Holocaust, when many of the Nazis were caught and put on trial, because they were put on trial during the 1960s. There was a highly publicized Nuremberg trial. And what the Nazis would usually say to defend their actions was, I was only following orders. So were they only following orders? That's what he was wondering. Were they only following orders? And could the same thing happen here in America? Right? Could there be a Holocaust here in America? So to prove his point, or to answer his research question, Milgram set up painful electric shock experiments where he asked one participant to administer the painful electric shocks to another participant. And I actually have the picture right there below. So on the left, you have the person who is administering the electric shocks, and the person that is strapped into the machine on the right is receiving the shocks. So how did Milgram recruit his participants? What did his sample look like? Well, he placed ads in newspapers in order to recruit participants, which included people that were postal clerks, engineers, high school teachers, laborers, because he wanted a similar demographic to kind of reflect the same demographic of the Nazis. And as you know, the Nazis included everyone from the working class to the upper middle class, right? Because you had your people at the very bottom, and then you had your officers, your captains at the very top. So that is why he included people from all different types of classes. Now, the participants were told that it was a study on the effects of punishment on learning. So there was some deception used in this study. They didn't tell them exactly what they were looking for. Instead, they said, you're going to be given a sheet of paper with words written on them. And then those words were supposed to be recited to the other person on the other end, the learner who was strapped in to the electric shock machine. And the learner had to repeat those words from memory back to the teacher who had just finished reciting them. But if the learner got any of those words wrong, and it was possible that they would get it wrong because they were reciting it from memory, then they would receive a painful electric shock. And so there was 3 people involved in this study. There was the learner, so that's the person that would recite the words from memory back to the teacher, and the teacher was the one who would administer the shocks. And then there was the experimenter who was just kind of around there in the vicinity, kind of overseeing the experiment. And he was dressed in a lab coat, like experimenters are often dressed. And the teacher was asked to administer those shocks, like I said, but at the very beginning, the teacher was given a sample shock of 45 volts, and they were told that although the shocks were going to be painful, that the participant was going to be feeling them, they would cause no permanent tissue damage. However, I did say that this study involved deception. There were actually never any real shocks administered. This device that the person was strapped into was like a prop. So anytime the teacher would turn the dial, the person on the other end, the learner, was just acting. They would try to act like they were in pain. They would bang on the wall, or there was already some pre-recorded sounds built into the machine where it sounded like the person was like making noises, right? Like that they were like screaming in pain. So the whole time, the learner, the one that was on the other end, the receiving end of the shocks, it was an actor. They were in on it. This actor pretended to be in pain, and the teacher had a knob that went all the way up to 450 volts. So once the experiment was progressing, the researchers found that the teacher, the one who was administering the shocks, started to feel uncomfortable as the voltage was going higher. And to try to remedy this issue, the researcher would tell them, please continue. And you can see the picture here at the bottom left. The person is kind of looking back at the experimenter, and he's like, are you sure? Like, it sounds like I'm really hurting them. I don't feel good about this. And then the experimenter would say, the experiment requires that you continue. And then you can see on the bottom right picture, the participant looks very stressed out, very upset. It's very possible that they were under psychological distress. And again, the experimenter, like the researcher overlooking the experiment, would say, you have no other choice. You must go on. So what the study found was that 2/3 of the participants fell into the category of obedient subjects. That meant that about 66% of the participants administered the max amount of voltage, which was 450 volts, like I told you. Um, and these findings, they shocked many researchers, including psychiatrists, because they predicted that only 2% or even less than 2% of participants would even dare go that high, dare go up to the 450 volts. But as you can see, the results were 66% or two-thirds of the participants falling into the category of obedient subjects. Now I always tell my students, did these people have a choice? Yes, they did. The guy in this photo right here, he could have stopped too. You could tell it was bothering his conscience, so he could have stopped. But the only reason he continued was because he was being obedient to an authority figure. It was for no other reason than that. It's not like this authority figure had some sort of power over him. He could leave the experiment whenever he wanted, but I think this experiment really uncovered the nature of people's psychology and of how far they'll go when obeying authority. So what implications did Milgram's study have? Well, if you can remember back to his original research question, originally Milgram wanted to understand the Germans' obedience during the Holocaust. And what he found through his research was that people submit to authority, even if it's against their personal beliefs. And you saw an example of that in the previous slide, where I had the pictures of the male participant who was visibly uncomfortable, but he still was obedient because he wanted to follow the authority figure, and it was for no other reason than being obedient. There was no really reward or a penalty for his behavior. It was just he saw an authority figure and he thought that it was the right thing to do at that moment, even though inside of him, right, he was not feeling good about his actions. The second implication that it had was a much more controversial statement and implication than the first one, is that Milgram believed that under the right social conditions, we could have a Holocaust here in the United States. Now, this sent the American public into an uproar. And the reason for that being that they did not want to be compared at all to Nazis. The Nazis around that time in the 1960s were demonized, right? They were evil. And for him to say that we Americans were capable of that sort of evil, that was a revolting, disgusting idea for Americans. So, many people were upset at him, especially just the American public. And so the thing about it is that he really didn't get to prove his point until many years later, close to 40 years later, when we had the Abu Ghraib incident. Many of you may not remember the Abu Ghraib incident because you were probably too young to remember, but Abu Ghraib was a prison in Iraq, and it was an Iraqi prison that was taken over by U.S. soldiers, and it was used to house prisoners there, specifically terrorists. So what happened in this Iraqi prison is that there were many human rights violations going on. The American soldiers were physically torturing the prisoners. They were sexually abusing them, they were raping them, they were sodomizing them. They basically violated the Geneva Conventions because, as you know, the Geneva Conventions state that we should treat prisoners of war humanely, but these soldiers were not treating these prisoners humanely. And the only reason that these abuses came to light in 2003 were because there was a reporter who worked for Amnesty International, and he somehow came across some of the prisoners, and later he intercepted some photographs that the soldiers had taken of the abuses. And those pictures were released in 2004 and 2006. And when those pictures got released, it was a media frenzy, and these individuals were demonized. And so when they were on the stand, right, when they were being court-martialed for these horrendous actions, they were asked, why did you do it? Why would you treat a prisoner in such a way? And guess what they said? I'm pretty sure you know already. They said the exact same thing that the Nazis said. They were just following orders, right? And it actually, they were court-martialed. Nobody really believed them that they were following orders. But later, the torture memos came to light, where all these high-level officials, right, these generals and colonels, were sending emails or letters to the soldiers at these prison camps, and they were telling them that they should use these tactics to extract that information from the prisoners. And so, in the end, it is true, the soldiers were following orders, right? You had these high-level officials telling them it was okay to do that sort of torture. Let's move on to the next section of the Deviance Chapter, which is entitled Crime. So, crime is known as a violation of criminal law for which some government authority applies formal penalties or fines. And in the US, you can be imprisoned for committing a crime. In other countries, they have different types of punishments, and it's all because they do not have the economic means to be able to create this intricate criminal justice system the way that the United States does. So they have to resort to more traditional forms of punishment. So the first one I wanted to talk about was shunning. So shunning means that no one will talk to you in your community. So when you do something like in a small village, and as you know, small villages don't have prisons. So what the community will do instead is they will shun you. They'll say, they'll ignore you, right? Or they'll tell you, can you please leave our village? So that's banishment, right? When they tell you, please leave our village, our community doesn't need you here anymore, they are banishing you. The other type of punishment would be corporal punishment. So a public lashing, or a stoning, or even chopping off someone's hand for theft. These are all types of corporal punishment. Now, corporal punishment is still in use here in the United States in the form of like the death penalty. We have the electric chair and the lethal injection and all sorts of other corporal punishments. Whenever criminologists talk about crime, they usually focus on index crimes. So index crimes are 8 types of crime reported annually by the FBI in the Uniform Crime Reports. That's abbreviated as UCR for short. And the Uniform Crime Reports is collected by 17,000 local law enforcement agencies, and that includes your courts, your police departments, and your prisons. They get all this information from those law enforcement agencies. And they report on mainly 8 types of crime. Those are considered the main crimes that are plaguing our society today. So the first type is murder. The second is forcible rape. Third is robbery. Robbery is usually taking something by force or threat of force, and there's people present. The number 4 is aggravated assault, and those 1 through 4 are considered violent crimes, and they're also considered crimes against people. Then you have 5 through 8, which are burglary, larceny, theft, motor vehicle theft, and arson, which means you're using fire to destroy someone's property. So all of those crimes, 5 through 8, they're considered property crimes. Like with burglary, usually people aren't present. You go into a house, and if you're burglarizing it, you probably take a few items and you leave. Same thing with larceny theft. Larceny theft, actually, sometimes people are present. Like, say, for example, if you go into a Target store and take a candy bar, that's considered theft, and there are people around, but you're not really interacting with an individual. You're not taking that candy bar out of somebody's hand, right? That's something else completely. So yeah, those are the types of crimes that the UCR reports on. So here's a slide on the national crime rates and percentage change. And usually the question that I ask my students in class is whether they think crime has gone up or down in the last 15 years. And usually my students will say that they think crime has gone up in the last 15 years. And I say, why do you say that? And they say, well, on the news, you see all these instances of people being murdered or kidnapped or raped. You see it on your Facebook feed. You see it on the internet. Pretty much anywhere you turn, you have all these shows on TV that have to do with crime. So they're just being bombarded constantly by the media, which is why they have that opinion. But in fact, crime has gone down in the last 10 to 15 years. And it's actually gone down overall since 1991. In 1991, we had 15 million crimes, and by 2010, it was down to 10.4 million. And the interesting thing about that is that since 1991, we've added 50 million people to our population. And so it goes to reason, right? When you have a bigger population, that you'd probably have an increase in crime, but that's not the case. Actually, crime has gone down. And the reasons that I give in class to talk about why crime has gone down is that generally we are a little bit tougher on crime. We have the 3 strikes law. So we have a lot of offenders that might have been repeat offenders, and now they're not out on the streets anymore. They're in jail because of the 3 strikes law. We also have new programs that have been implemented in the prisons to educate the prisoners, to reintegrate them into society. We also have other nonprofit organizations working outside of the prisons that attempt to teach the prisoners a new skill so that they can then reintegrate into society by getting a job and making a living wage. And another reason that I give is just changes in the economy. So the economy, we were going through a very large recession in the 1990s, and while we did go into a recession in 2008, again, it wasn't as severe as the 1990s recession. So that might be a reason too. The economy is doing a little bit better. And here, if you look at the slide, you can see the percentage change of each of the crimes from 2002 till 2012. And I'm just going to focus on the 2 major crimes in each category among the violent and the property crimes. So for violent crimes, you see that aggravated assault is the most common type of crime, and that is down 22% since 2002. And then among the property crimes, the most common type of crime is larceny theft, and that looks to be down by 19.3%. So all of these crimes have definitely decreased. We're just going to skip over this slide. I'm not going to be testing you on anything for this slide. Feel free to read your book. It gives you a little bit more information about the Uniform Crime Reports. We're also going to skip over this slide, which is the UCR Geographic Divisions of the U.S. You are not going to be tested on this. So we were talking about the Uniform Crime Report 3 slides ago, and we said how it was gathered by 17,000 local law enforcement agencies. And it's one of the most reliable sources of crime statistics, but it does have some limitations. And that limitation is that the only crimes that are on there, statistically represented, are the crimes that are being reported. So unless the police officer witnesses the crime happening or it's reported to the police officer, then the crime does not get recorded by the FBI in the Uniform Crime Reports. And so to try to remedy this issue or this limitation of the victimization survey, researchers have come up with another way to measure crime. So it's supposed to complement the Uniform Crime Report. And I just want to give you a quick example. So for hate crimes, there's about 6,700 hate crimes that are reported to the Uniform Crime Reports in a given year, let's say. Well, that number is actually much lower than the amount that is being reported through the victimization survey. Through the victimization survey, the researchers have been able to find that hate crimes are actually a little bit closer to 192,000 per year. So look at that discrepancy. That's a big discrepancy. 6,700 to 192,000. Big discrepancy. And so the victimization survey is a questionnaire or an interview that's given to a sample of the population to determine whether or not they've been victims of crime. And it's actually distributed to about 40,000 households in the United States. And it's taken by 70,000 people, because a household can have more than one person living in that house. And people are allowed to take the survey if they are 12 years or older, and it's usually administered by an interviewer. So an interviewer will go to someone's household and ask them a series of screening questions. Those screening questions are supposed to determine whether or not you've been a victim of crime in the past year. Once they finish those screening questions, let's say that you happen to say, yeah, I have been a victim of crime. Then they go on to the second set of questions where they ask you more about your involvement with that incident. They'll say, well, what kind of crime was it? What was the nature of the crime? Where did it happen? Did it happen in your home? Did it happen nearby, in a commercial area, at your friend's house? At what time of the day did it happen? Who did the assailant, did the assailant look male, female? Were they a certain race? How old did they look? So they ask them all these different things about the offender, and they ask them about them, right? About the victims, like, their age, sex, class status, all of that. And again, this is to try to remedy that situation of people not reporting crimes to the police. And you can think of in your own life, I'm sure you've been a victim of crime. Somebody has stolen your cell phone, or somebody has damaged your property, like maybe your car was keyed, or even some of you have been assaulted. You've been in a physical altercation, maybe at a bar or at a club, but you didn't report it. So many of you have been victims of crime but don't report it because you might see it as trivial or unimportant. You might see it as a waste of time, really, because the cops may not be able to find the offender. Maybe you're embarrassed. Maybe you don't have property insurance. Like maybe somebody steals your laptop from the library and you don't have it insured. So you know that going to the police isn't really going to do much. So you just kind of let it go. Again, some people don't believe or have faith that the police will do anything. Sometimes they distrust the police and they'd rather just not deal with them altogether. So that is why they do these surveys, so that people will be able to actually have a better idea of the amount of crimes that are going on within our society. Now we're going to move on to conflict perspective, which is a theoretical perspective that you were introduced to in the first chapter. So first off, I want you to try to recall what you learned from chapter 1. What is conflict perspective? Right now would be a very good time to pause it, to try to think about what conflict perspective is. And then in a second, I'll revisit it and try to sum it up for you one more time. So I'm just going to pause it here, and you can pause it if you want, and we'll just come back in a couple seconds. So conflict perspective is a theory that was developed by Karl Marx, and it talked about an unequal distribution of resources in society. Karl Marx saw society as being conflict-ridden because there were groups with differing amount of power and differing degrees of resources. And so as long as people were unequal, as long as social inequality existed within a society, you were going to have conflict. So how does conflict relate to crime, right? Why are we looking at this theory? Well, there is a conflict perspective of crime, and it was very influential in the field of criminology. There were a number of famous criminologists who adopted Marx's view and applied it to crime. So conflict theory suggests that deviance or crime is inevitable whenever two groups have differing degrees of power. So the more inequality you have in a society, the higher the crime rate. You have the ruling class and you have the inferior class, but they don't have the same access to resources or the same paths to success. So the people at the bottom respond by committing crime. And the more impoverished or oppressed the worker population is, the higher the crime you will have in that country. Another thing about conflict perspective of crime is that the people that are in power define what is criminal and what is not. And those definitions usually reflect the values or the interests of the ruling class, the people at the very top. They're the ones who set the laws, right? They're the ones who have the influence. They're the ones that have the money to lobby politicians to make sure certain laws go into effect or do not go into effect. So an example of this would be how working class crime has higher penalties attached to it, such as burglary, versus a ruling class crime like embezzlement. So you're much more likely, if you're a working class individual, to burglarize a home, whereas somebody from the ruling class, because they have access to a lot of sensitive banking information, they're more likely to embezzle. So embezzlement means that you're stealing money from like a corporation. And with embezzlement, if it's under $950, if you steal under $950, it's a misdemeanor. If it's over $950, it's a felony. So you get 2 to 3 years. But with burglary, if you enter a house, an apartment, or a hotel room to steal, even if you don't take anything from that hotel room or from that house, it's always considered a felony. So there's no dollar amount there. It's always considered a felony if you enter an apartment or a house, even if no one's there. Like there's no occupants, and usually people who burglarize homes go when there is no occupants. But it's always going to be a felony, and you can get about 2, 4, or 6 years in prison for burglary, whereas for embezzlement you can get about 2 to 3. But usually people who are embezzling, they have such good lawyers or they have a lot of money, so they don't even have to worry about doing a prison sentence. Usually they just serve probation. It's kind of like a slap on the wrist for the rich. So we just finished talking about the difference between blue collar working class crime and upper class or ruling class crime. Another way to call that sort of crime committed by middle class or upper class individuals is white collar crime. So these white collar criminals commit illegal acts in the course of their business activities, and they are seemingly respectable people. And that term also includes crimes that are committed by corporations and businesses. I don't know if you guys heard about Walmart, but Walmart was caught dumping hazardous materials, illegally dumping hazardous materials into their dumpsters, where these sort of substances like laundry detergents and other chemical substances are supposed to be disposed of differently. So they were violating that law across most of their stores in the United States, and because of that, they were fined millions of dollars. I think it was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. That's seen as a white collar crime. And white collar criminals are often given the benefit of the doubt because of their seeming respectability. For example, you have Bernie Madoff, and this is a perfect example of how ruling class crime or ruling class people are able to kind of get away with a little bit more things than the working class people. So I'm going to tell you Bernie Madoff's story. Madoff is convicted and credited with committing the largest financial fraud in U.S. history. He owned a company in New York, a financial investment company, and he, to get people to invest in his company, because he started it in the 1980s, he promised people a 15 to 20% return on their investment. And that was a pretty high number to be promising people, especially when the market fluctuates. So you can never guarantee really any sort of return on people's investments. But he did this, and he, like I said, he did deliver, but he was able to deliver using a Ponzi scheme. So he was able to pay off his investments, his older investors, with money that he would get from newer clients. So he had borrower one give him $1 million, and then he would promise them their returns, and borrower two would come in and say, "Hey, I want to invest some money with you too." So he would take the money that was invested by borrower two and give those dividends over to borrower one, and that's how he was able to make the 15 to 20% return. But this kept going, right? Because he kept having newer investors and newer investors. And it was just really intricate. By the time he reached, the 2000, the early 2000s, he had a lot of people entrusting him with their money. And but it wasn't until the 2008 economic downturn where he got caught. Because during the downturn, a lot of his investors said, "Give us our money back. We don't want to invest right now because the market's not doing so well. So can we please have our money back?" But he didn't have their money, right? Because he was using their money to pay off older investors, and it was just something that was not possible for him to do. So because of the downturn in 2008, he was facing a lot of pressure, and he confessed to his son that he was mismanaging money and that he was a fraud. He was a fraudster, that he was defrauding people of their money. And because of that, he was sentenced to 150 years in prison for mismanaging, or I think in total, the amount of money that he took from people and that they lost was about $18 billion total. And the thing about Bernie Madoff's situation is that there was a person working at another financial investment company. His name is Harry Markopolos. he was a financial analyst that was trying to alert the authorities since 1999. He tried to tell the Securities and Exchange Commission that Bernie Madoff was ripping people off, but they kept kind of just giving Harry Markopolos the runaround, because Harry Markopolos was not an influential man the way that Bernie Madoff was. Harry was just a low grade financial analyst, and Bernie was a financial genius. So because of that whole power differential, they kind of just said, no, it's okay. Bernie's just, he's too big to stop, right? And the Securities and Exchange Commission looked the other way, which was a big mistake, because if they had just listened to Harry, they would have saved billions of dollars. They would have saved people from being defrauded of billions of dollars. On this slide, there's only one term that I want you to know, and that's victimless crimes. So, victimless crimes refer to the willing exchange among adults of widely desired but illegal goods and services, such as drugs or prostitution or gambling. And the reason that these three particular crimes, drugs, prostitution, and gambling, are seen as victimless crimes are because you have both participants willing to engage in the illegal activity. So you have the drug dealer who's willing to sell the drugs to a willing participant who wants to buy the drugs, right? The drug user who wants to buy the drugs. Or the prostitute who wants to sell her body to the client who's willing to pay for it. And the same thing goes for gambling. So it's a very simple term, but I think it's a very interesting name, a victimless crime, because the way that criminal justice researchers see it, the people are not victims, they're both willing. So now let's move on to the very last section of the chapter, which is on deviance. Deviance is a behavior, trait, or belief that departs from a norm, and it generates a negative reaction in a particular group. Deviance isn't necessarily bad, it's just different from what the group considers to be normal. So a woman with a size 13 shoe is not bad, but it's different. So she may get negative reactions from people with average shoe size. They might ridicule her or ask her rude questions about her shoe size, like, oh my goodness, look at you, you have big feet. Anything that departs from the norm is deviant. Now, defining an act as deviant depends on the context or the area that you're in. For example, if we're looking at context, taking another life. So in what context is it okay to take another person's life? Just think on that. Well, the answer to that is in war. When you are at war with somebody, then it's okay, right? It's forgivable to take someone else's life. Or in self-defense, if someone comes toward you and they're being threatening, and you know that you might lose your own life if you don't react, then it's okay. It's okay to take their life if they're going to try to take yours. So then, in that context, it's okay to take another life. But when it's in cold blood, right, if you're just taking a life in vain, then it's considered a crime. So it's only deviant depending on the context. Same thing goes for statutory rape law. So here in the United States, we have so many different ages of consent. Like in California, the age of consent is 18. So if you have sex with an 18-year-old, that's fine. But if they are 17, that's a big no-no. But if you go to New Mexico, it's okay, because in New Mexico, their age of consent is 17. So over there, you're not committing a crime, but over here in California, you are. But in New Mexico, if you have sex with a 16-year-old, that is not okay. However, if you move over to Nevada, then it's okay, because in Nevada, the age of consent is 16. So you can see what I mean by deviance depending on context or area, because it's not that these girls in Nevada or New Mexico are any different than the girls in California. It's just that in Nevada or in New Mexico, they define the age of consent differently. They see women as adults when they're 16 or 17 instead of 18. And then lastly, what's deviant in one culture may not be deviant in another culture. So I'm going to show you the pictures on the next slide. So on this slide, you can see 4 pictures here. And according to US standards, I want you to answer this question on your own, obviously. According to US standards, are these people at the right normal, or are they deviant? So let's start with the top left picture. That is a woman from Burma, and she's wearing a necklace of gold that elongates her neck. So would that be deviant in our culture? Yes, it would. What about the woman to the right, who is wearing a plate in her lip? And so her lip is stretched out by this plate. Is that seen as deviant in our culture? Definitely. The man at the very bottom left, he has a tongue that is split in half. He had his tongue modified so that he could be able to have like a snake tongue. And that's seen as deviant. And then at the bottom right, you can see a basketball player with tattoos. And when I ask my students if that's deviant, they always say that it is. And I tell them, well, actually, it's becoming a little bit more normalized now in our culture. So tattooing may not have been normal in the 1900s, maybe not even in the 1950s, but it started becoming normalized after sailors introduced it into popular American culture, and all these other servicemen started getting tattoos. So you had military individuals who were getting tattoos, and then just regular individuals, non-military, that started adapting this sort of culture. And now we are in the 2000s, right? 2016, and it's becoming a lot more normal to have a tattoo. It's not seen so much as a deviant thing. I'm going to skip over this slide because I will not be testing you on any of the concepts here. Now I want to discuss Murden's theory of deviance. Robert Murden, a very famous sociologist, built upon Durkheim's theory of deviance, and he came up with strain theory. And what he said was that every society has goals, but not everyone has the means to attain those goals. And what are the goals that he's talking about? Well, according to our society, our American values, what we should want for ourselves is a nice house, a car, possibly a family, right? Maybe even a pet. So all the things that you should want for yourself is just to live a decent life. And those are the goals that we have for America. But again, not everyone has the means to attain those goals. Our society sometimes makes it impossible for certain people to get to that level. And because of that, it creates a stress or a strain because people are aware of the goals, but they don't have the means to achieve them. So, because of that, he said that there's 5 basic forms of cultural adaptation. The conformist, the innovator, the ritualist, the retreatist, and the rebel. When someone fails to recognize and accept the goals or the means, or both, they become a social deviant. So for those 5 that I just listed right now, the social deviants would be innovator, ritualist, retreatist, and the rebel. And also on a side note, he did not assume that everyone would want those goals for themselves. So there are the societal goals like having a house, but maybe not everybody wants that for themselves. So that's just on a side note. Okay, so here's Merton's typology of deviance table. And this is just a visual to help you kind of see what he was trying to say about each of the different typologies. But on the left, you see cultural goals. The cultural goal, again, would be like the American dream, to have a car, to have the kids, to have the house, all of that. And at the top, you'll see institutionalized means. So institutionalized means represents going to school, getting your diploma or your bachelor's. Another type of institutionalized mean would be to get a job and work your way up until you have a good career. So a conformist, if you would read that, they accept the cultural goals and they accept the institutionalized means to get there. A retreatist rejects the goals and rejects the means. And a rebel, he's completely on his own tile there. He has new goals, new means. And if this is a little bit hard to understand for you, don't worry. I'm going to break each of these typologies down over the next few slides. With me? So you have the first type is a conformist. Like I said, they accept the goals of the society and the means of achieving those goals. All of you are conformists, every single one of my students, because you folks want something better for yourselves, and you know that the way to get that goal or that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is to stay in school. So you are all conformist. The next typology are innovators. So innovators accept the goals of society. They want the house, the car, the kids, but they reject the means to get there. So that means they don't want to go to college for 4 years. They don't want to go into a company and work their way up. They want it, they're a little bit impatient, right? They want it now. Or they don't want to take the means to get there. So they look for new or innovative ways to achieve those goals. Can you think of anybody that fits that description of somebody who wanted the American dream but didn't want to work hard to get there? Well, usually when I ask my class this question, they come up with Bill Gates, who dropped out of college but now is a mega billionaire. But then also another example that my students come up with are criminals, like drug dealers or pimps, because they don't really have to work too hard to make a living, and they're being innovative, right, with the type of business that they do, instead of going to college or having a regular career. The next typology is a ritualist. So ritualists are not interested in the goals of society, but they do accept the means of achieving those goals. So they don't seem to think about the goal or the big picture, and instead they live their lives day to day, paycheck to paycheck. They'll go to work, they'll have a steady job, and so on, but they probably live in an apartment or in their parents' basement. They don't talk about career moves or retirement, and they simply keep doing their routine every day. This is probably one of the hardest examples to think of, right? To just think of a popular example for this category of people, the ritualists. Because famous people generally don't present themselves as ritualists. But the best example that I could give you would be The Big Lebowski. I don't know if you folks have seen that movie, but it's a man, they call him the Dude, and he lives in an apartment. It seems like he's unemployed or he does odd jobs, but he's kind of like a hippie. He doesn't really care to make a lot of money or to have more in his life. He's fine the way he is. Like he likes his apartment. He's comfortable with his life. And yeah, and so that would be a good example of that. Or just anybody like I described right now, kind of living in someone's basement or living in an apartment and not really having that desire to move up. That would be a ritualist. The other typology are retreatists. So retreatists don't accept the cultural goals of society, so they reject the goals and they reject the means of getting there. And they are also seen as being withdrawn from the system. And an example of a retreatist would probably be a hermit or a person who goes to the mountains to live in a cabin on their own, secluded from everyone else. A drug user, maybe, an alcoholic. And students sometimes give the example in class of homeless people. They say, well, homeless people, because they think that they are withdrawn from society. But I want to remind people that not all homeless people are there because they want to be, right? Some people, don't have a home because of circumstances that led them there, not because they wanted to withdraw from the system. Um, so yeah, homeless people. It depends on what type of homeless person you're talking about because not everybody's there by choice. Finally, our last typology are rebels. So rebels don't accept the goals of society or the means of achieving those goals, so they create their own goals using new means. And with rebels, they want to change or destroy the social institutions from which they are alienated, and that is their main goal. I always give people the example of hippies, right? Because hippies didn't agree with the goals of society, and they disagreed with the means of achieving them, and they didn't covet, for example, lots of money the way that the American people did. American people just wanted to do better economically, and for hippies, that was something that they did not want for themselves. They didn't really need a fancy car or a nice house, and so on. They tried to talk against materialism. And another one that I always give, another example, would be terrorists. So terrorists would be considered rebels because within their own societies, they don't accept the goals and they don't accept the means. So they try to create this new society that will accommodate their goals and their means of achieving them. And so terrorists and hippies are good examples. Even Che Guevara, who fought for communism in Cuba, or Martin Luther King, who fought for the civil rights movement here in the United States.